It is my very great pleasure to introduce Ronnie Close, who's come to talk in this, which is the last Sussex Centre for the Visual event of the term. Ronnie has somehow developed a kind of an ongoing relationship with Sussex. I guess primarily because we've known one another for quite a long time. And working here, it provided me with the opportunity to get Ronnie over on various occasions. Initially, Ronnie exhibited a film piece related to one of the film pieces you're going to see today as part of the Brighton Photo Biennial, which I co-curated in 2012. And that has kind of served as the basis for a kind of a much larger film project that then kind of served as a stepping stone towards another film project. So you're going to see both of those today. Ronnie has exhibited internationally at a range of film festivals, museums, galleries. Most recently he showed one of the films that you're going to be seeing today at Quad in Derby. He's also shown it at the National Museum of Football, and he's exhibited at galleries including the Arnolfini in Bristol. He's currently based in Cairo, where he works at the American University. So the format of the evening, Ronnie's going to briefly introduce the two films. We'll show the two films back to back, which is quite an exciting prospect in that it's not been done before, these two films shown together. Then we'll have a Q&A between Ronnie and myself, and then we'll open it up for questions. So please, yeah, be thinking about things that you might want to ask Ronnie. Ronnie.
Okay. All right, thank you for coming. So as Ben said, the format will be a screening of two short films, they're not too long. The first one is called More Out of Curiosity, it's 25 minutes long. The second one is called Serious Games and is 18 minutes long, so a little under 20 minutes. And I'm just going to give you a very short intro to both film projects so you kind of have a little bit of a context of what you're going to look at. So I moved to Egypt in 2012, January 2012, so I sort of missed the revolution. It was like a year late for the revolution. And so I kind of moved to a place that was still in a lot of sort of social upheaval and you know, flux and very kind of slightly anarchaic, with a number of kind of political movements from, you know, radical Islamists to left-wing agitators. And we actually, the last time I screened the earlier version of the film, we had a left-wing Egyptian agitator in the room, which was actually fantastic, and I'll talk about that maybe in the Q&A, how she facilitated the project in a really interesting way. But anyway, so I moved there. I was there 3 weeks, and there was a horrific incident. And there were a number of horrific incidents, but this was a particularly terrible one, but not unique. And in a way, it became kind of the big issue, but it was also related to football. And so I was kind of there a couple of weeks, so I sort of naturally was moving towards looking at this situation, what was happening. So I started to go out and film on the streets, follow some of the demonstrations, and it was where, you know, a group of ultras football supporters from Cairo, which again was a bit of a sort of hybridity that I hadn't known about, wasn't in the you know, the sort of cultural histories of Egypt at that point. So I was kind of curious, how are these like Italian-themed football fans in Egypt? And then, so they were very visible, they were mounting a kind of protest campaign in the streets, so I started to work on it. And then I started to kind of discover that there was this whole kind of subculture, you know, across the world really, of politicized football fans. And that the ultras in Egypt were one of actually many ultra organizations within Egypt, but right across the Middle East and obviously into Europe and so forth. So I started to follow this, I started to work with them, I started to try and, I guess, get to know them and make a film work with them. And it took about 2 years really to get from that initial point of the incident of the Port Said attack, where 74 fans were murdered in highly suspicious circumstances, at a football game. And I followed that for about 2 years. It took me about 2 years to finish it into a piece of work. So I started in 2012, and as Ben just said, in the summer I had an exhibition and the number of screenings in the UK. So in a way, that was the kind of endpoint for that particular film. But then, as I was working on it, obviously, as we know, a lot of you know, 2013 there were very big protests in Brazil that were kind of anticipating what was going to happen with the World Cup there. So the World Cup was last summer, and that made it something that I felt would be a good idea to look at and to try and make a piece of work around the same kinds of issues, which is in a very simple way, it's kind of using football or football culture or the communities that congregate around football as a cipher to think about commodification, you know, neoliberalism, urbanization, all these kinds of issues. So I made a second film in the summer in Brazil when I was there. I stayed in a favela in Rio de Janeiro for a month called Serious Games, and that'll be the second film that you'll watch. I think that's about it, really. Yeah, that's kind of enough. So we'll do the screening and then...
Yeah, just do one followed by the other,
yeah,
and then we'll go into the conversation.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Ronnie. That's the first time I've seen the two back to back. That's a lot to get to get your head around. There's so much they share, and yet there's so much that makes them distinct. And it's, in a sense, it's kind of one of the first. We were kind of prepping undergraduate students on how to write and to formulate an essay title. We suggest well, comparison is one of the ways you can kind of guarantee a degree of criticality. There's so much that one can talk about in terms of similarities and differences, and the significance of those similarities and differences. So that's really what I want us to focus on. Both of those films are to some extent, I mean, they're about all sorts of things in terms of football and politics, and in terms of mediation, in terms of space. I think there's a lot to be said about different types of space and how they're occupied and how they're used, and then how that relates to ideas around mediation. But there's also an extent to which both of those films, I think, can be understood in terms of your relationship to particular places and to particular events that occurred within those places. So can we start off by talking a bit about that in terms of these contrasts, so your relationship to the subjects within those films, to the places and to the people, and how you feel that makes those two films distinct.
Okay, well, you know, there's kind of lots of, I guess you could say, problems, or maybe challenges or misinterpretations or issues around representation, because you know, I mean, when I began the Cairo film, I'd only moved to Cairo, so I didn't speak any Arabic. You know, and you know, obviously over the process of being there, that changed. But you know, it's not only the problematics or the issues about being a filmmaker or being involved in the representation game, but also the linguistic displacement is so extreme, and similarly in Brazil. Very few people speak English. In fact, I'd probably say more people can speak English easily in Cairo than in Brazil. So again, you've got these kind of linguistic barriers, you've got issues around what you're actually filming, you're not actually sure what it is you're actually filming. And then of course, afterwards you need to go through the whole process of trying to transcribe, translate, distill, work with that material. And things are revealed through that you obviously aren't really aware of at the time. So there's so many, it's like what would you say, it's like a minefield of things that you can fall into. So in a way, my response was to try and make those problematics quite visible in the films themselves. So in the Ultras film, More Out of Curiosity, I mean, the title itself actually comes from a Harun Faruqi film called Videograms of Revolution, and it's a bit in the film where the cameraman strays off from what he's supposed, a state cameraman, in Romania strays off from what he's supposed to be filming, and he says more out of curiosity than conviction. And that part of that kind of really struck me, but then I sort of shortened it a bit and appropriated it for my own use, because in a sense that was very much how I felt I could present my position within it, that although I've obviously got a interest and obligation or need to try to deal with what happened in those places, but in the same way I can only mediate it through my own cultural context, my own lack of understanding and knowledge as well. So I don't know how apparent this is, and maybe I shouldn't spell things out, but at the end of the Ultras film, More Out of Curiosity, the camera kind of moves through a very tight pack of them on one of those celebration days after the court case, in a way that felt like, you know, the film's kind of bookended by the beginning of Port Said and the ending, court case and celebration, but that kind of movement of the camera, which was, you know, not an artistic strategy, it was just a pragmatic solution in that kind of space. But to me, it felt like a kind of fitting way to conclude it, because very much placed me as this outsider with a camera in that position of trying to navigate or trying to understand or have a kind of proximity. And I'd say Brazil was, the experience of being in Brazil was kind of very different, because it was a much shorter time phase, and there was this mega you know, sporting cultural event as the kind of framework to it. But again, you know, I guess for instance, in Brazil, I think I interviewed like 14 different people, a very broad range of people, some football fans, some sociologists, some people from the favela where I was staying in, on a range of subjects to do about the really aggressive kind of neoliberalist Brazilian government policies, and part of it is actually really gentrifying favelas in Brazil. So I kind of talk to people around these kinds of issues that are quite, you know, have quite a history. But really, I kind of, as I worked with the material, I kind of just sort of focused or circled in on this one football supporter who I interviewed, or not even interviewed, because I didn't actually ask him a question. You know, I just, I mean, that's why I sort of tried to include where you can see me trying to focus the camera and adjust the exposure, because it literally, I met him, I knew him, he told me what had happened. I was there, but I also hadn't been in the metro where he was, where there was a lot of really terrible police brutality. So he wanted to say something, you know, he wanted to speak back, he wanted to kind of relate that experience. So I guess the films in a way are, you know, very much, I try to place myself and imagine also, you know, a viewer who isn't from those places and hasn't been there, hasn't witnessed or experienced those kinds of things, you know, how they would read it, because there is I mean, it's the kind of language issue, and you know, the way that I've always tried to work with sort of distilling language down to a kind of essence. You know, there is an approach that's sort of slightly unorthodox from a documentary film.
Was it, in a sense, that answer takes us in two directions, one of two directions, and I think those two directions are in themselves indicative of what you're dealing with in the film. One of them, you kind of mentioned the idea of obligation, and I think that's a really interesting route to go down, your obligation as a filmmaker, and the extent to which that's rooted both in your personal politics but also in your personal relationships with the people in those films, and there are some fundamental differences between the films in those terms, and I'm very interested to talk a bit more about those relationships, how they developed, and the extent to which that shapes your agenda as a filmmaker. The other route we could go down is in terms of kind of football and politics, and the tensions and contradictions that relationship involves. and the extent to which those two possibilities seem to play out in the two films. And so that's the other route. But first of all, can we talk a bit about your personal obligation, I guess, is what I'd like to talk about. The extent to which you have some obligation to your subject, and that your subject in terms of the ultras are a group of people with whom you become increasingly familiar, with whom you share some sort of political conviction. Some, so yeah, I know it's not that simple. Whereas in Brazil, there is a certain obligation to the guy with the story. I mean, in a sense, he's one of the few people within this kind of grotesque neoliberal spectacle where you do seek out someone where there is that affiliation. But for me, ultras is about a kind of a group of people resisting that process. Serious Games is as much about the grotesqueness of that process as it is about the people who resist it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's different when you live somewhere, and you move there. You feel a sense of, at that time in Egypt, what was happening was this, myriad of kind of protests and different interest groups. Very, no elected government. There was a military council running the country. So you had a whole sense of things being contested, that things were kind of open. There was a sense of people reclaiming or defining what would happen. And the ultras were really, for me, deeply affecting. I think in a way you can kind of feel it when you watch the film. But you're watching it at a remove, you're watching it as a mediated experience. And when I began to meet them and to film their activities and stuff and get to know them a little bit, there was this amazing kind of energy and this kind of almost kind of aesthetics that they were involved in, this kind of choreographed dances and chants and stuff. So they were a very alluring kind of group to try and meet. But then at the same time, they were actually very contradictory because they were very open, they were very accessible, they were very visible, but they were highly secretive. Yeah. And the group you saw is the Al Ahly Ultras, and Al Ahly are like Man United of Egypt. They've got like a fan base of 30 million. So there's hundreds of thousands of ultras. So they're incredibly visible. They're a big team. They're over 100 years old. All this stuff, but they're really hard to get to know, and they really don't like the media. They're very suspicious of the media. There's a number of ultra groups, but the other rival team in Cairo is Zamalek, and their ultras are even more extreme, and they will never, have any involvement with the media. So it took me a long time, as you know very well. As Ben mentioned in the introduction, in 2012 at the biennial, I showed a much shorter version of that film as part of it that dealt a lot with the chanting and the kind of rituals. And while I was doing my presentation in a setting like this, we had an Egyptian student who was very vocal, was kind of, I guess, challenging a lot of the things that I said or the assumptions that I had at that time. But anyway, she facilitated the dialogue. I met her afterwards and she gave me some telephone numbers of more radicalized ultras. And through that, I actually got to meet the leadership of the ultras, which then agreed to collaborate and to give me access, because they generally don't do any kinds of interviews, and they certainly don't agree to be filmed on camera and stuff. So it was a very long process. It was like probably a year and a half to really get any kind of good access. So that, that's a very sort of personal proximity, I would say. And like you say, in Brazil it was a different case. It was I guess, really, sort of like parachuting into this environment and hoping that you can find something to work with. And the differences were quite stark because the football fans there are much more politicized. There's a much more established discourse of left and right. There are many, many different factions of the teams there. And the guy that's in the film, Pedro Torres, I met him at an event, I interviewed him a couple of times, and I just met him by chance.
Right.
The filming of that sort of riot scene is on the day of the World Cup.
Okay.
So it's actually happening about 4 kilometres from the Maracana Stadium. And that's why the police were so aggressive, you know, because they were really, they didn't want any small protest, you know, getting anywhere near the stadium. So, and I guess in a way there was something about that experience of what he wanted to say, that there was something kind of really genuine and really quite powerful in it. So in a way, I was attracted to that, and that's why I kind of kept it in a sort of pure time scene, whereas really the rest of the film, you know, is a kind of indirect sense of time throughout. And yeah, I mean, I would say that it was easier to get in Brazil. It was much easier to get access. It was much easier to do interviews. It was much easier to get a political analysis of what was happening, because the country's got, you know, a very sort of demarcated sense of politics. But you know, in the same way, I guess it was very much looking at those football fans in relation to this mega event, in relation to this, you know, commodified FIFA, you know, agenda, which is actually having effects on them and, you know, the wider society.
It's interesting. Go on.
Oh, I was just going to say one last thing. Is that the actual idea of proximity was quite interesting to me as well. Because in some ways, and you maybe noticed that one distinct difference between the Ultras film and the Brazil film is that the Ultras film has a lot more TV footage, internet footage. I got footage from the Ultras, so there's a kind of a sense of a lot of different kinds of imagery within it. Whereas the Brazil film is more or less kind of shot on during my time there. And what occurred to me was that the kind of idea of proximity is very important, because in some ways the kind of ideas around, you know, politics and football fans, I could make these films at a remove. I could really, like in Brazil, you probably noticed in the riot scene there were quite a few people with cameras. They have a very active alternative media group that will have all of that footage. You know, and they're all geared up for you know, violent filming. You know, they've all got GoPros and stuff like that, and gas masks. And all of that will be online very, very quickly. You know, and the same with the Ultras. Their YouTube channel is, you know, it's got a huge, like 1 million subscribers or something. So it's a huge entity, and you can find lots of stuff there. But I guess the difference is that I obviously don't think that I would have got that kind of quality or that kind of sense of something from Pedro in that interview or that statement at the end in Brazil. If I hadn't have gone there, I could have never found that on the internet, and I wouldn't have had that. There wouldn't have been any sense of any proximity to that. It would have been another piece of material to edit together. So there is a kind of distinction by physically being there and being present, despite the fact that it is sort of mediated and problematized by the presence of the camera and other issues. But I think if we are thinking about you know, the commodification of culture, you know, we are thinking about how people's lives are changed through systems, through forces that are beyond their control. And a lot of what these football fans have noticed in different places, really what it's about is it's about congregating, it's about coming together, it's about the body in space, it's about not being controlled in a stadium, not having a stadium that's all-seater. You know, these are the kinds of issues that are politicizing them. That's the kind of resistance that they're directly involved in. So it feels sort of like a good rationale to be physically there as well, rather than to sort of watch it at a remove, because the sense of it isn't the same. Your response to the material isn't the same.
So there is, it is the. It's your primary theme. It's interesting. Stephanie Schwartz, who's written about this and spoken about the film with you, has kind of said this isn't, well, neither of these necessarily films about football. That they are films that deal with precisely this, the idea of mediation and the kind of possibilities of existing within and without mediation, and where are possibilities for political agency with this, and they're complicated questions, and I think that both films do an incredible job of touching on that and kind of getting to the heart of those tensions and exposing them at the very least. I'd like to talk about some kind of particular bits within the films, and the kind of, I guess, the kind of contrasting spectacles that they set up. For me, there are some kind of key moments, one of which is the point when you show the ultras painting the banners. For me, is one of those kind of key points in the film where one witnesses the kind of the labour that exists behind all of this mediation. And there's an extent to it, there's almost an authenticity to that labour. And I think from that bit in the film, one can read out in so many directions, kind of across the narrative that you're putting together, to the YouTube videos, to the dancing, to so many other things, kind of as a product of a particular type of kind of political labour, political agency. And then there is a very different kind of spectacle at play in the Brazil film, which you kind of see in those kind of grotesque moments of bodily display. There's not necessarily grotesque, well there is, the kind of the guy doing the weird blacked out dancing and stuff is a very different type of spectacle. And so, I mean, I don't know if this was a question or an observation, whether you had any thoughts on, well, on that notion, is that too easy a kind of binary that I've set up, a kind of a good spectacle, bad spectacle, in a way?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing, because again, I didn't really know much about this kind of football culture before I started on it. I was a bit of a novice. But the thing that, struck me about the ultras in Cairo when I met them was that there was the kind of level of aesthetic preparation and labour, both in songs and they release CDs, stuff like that. Apart from the media, YouTube stuff they put out, but then is in this kind of preparation of these banners for these games, which the league has been suspended since Sports Aid, so or fans are not allowed into the stadiums. So all of that kind of culture has been part of a policy to reduce the potential of the ultras as a political agency within Egypt. But what struck me was this incredible kind of labour that went into things. That they were both kind of, defining, translating and narrating their experience and their culture. And that it was this kind of amazing sort of hybridity as well, because it's sort of partially Italian based, the words tifos, capos, so forth, so part of an Italian culture. But, it's coming through this sort of Egyptian street culture, and so, I mean, they really struck me by the incredible ability to self-organise, to self-mobilise, and to do it in a completely, non-hierarchical, with a sort of altruistic sort of fashion. There is no financial reward. There's nothing apart from taking. So in a way, it's kind of like a reclaiming of the spectacle. That the spectacle is a participatory event that you define, and you create, and you shape, and you define. Like they're not looking for acknowledgement from academics, from media people, from anybody. The only people they look for any acknowledgement from are other football fans internationally. So that's the kind of where the space they operate within. And in a sense, Brazil is a very different thing, because the football fans there, the torcidas that were involved in the protests, were also part of a very broad spectrum of Brazilian society that were involved in the protests. And there is this kind of tradition of the carnival, pageantry and stuff, and that's kind of quite visible. Very sort of highly stylized, performative dimension of the protest. there. So they're very, very distinct cultures. But certainly from what I was told by the fans that I met, that were Rio de Janeiro fans, the Maracana is the famous stadium in the city, and probably in Brazil, that has been completely rebuilt to FIFA's specs. So one of the floors has been removed. It's obviously become all-seater.
Right.
They put in plasma screens everywhere. So there's an attempt to, control the crowd, to control the body in space. And the torcidas are super famous. Like they date from the 40s. The whole idea of samba football, the bands, the pageantry they would bring to games. All of that has been curtailed. They're not allowed to bring instruments into the stadium. And apart from the fact that the ticket prices have obviously hiked up, so that means that the kind of lower class, working class people can't afford to go to the stadiums.
Yes.
So that sort of idea of this horizontal football fan culture is being subverted by the system, which FIFA are complicit in. Even despite their rhetoric, despite their attempted public relations and their funding of certain events globally, essentially FIFA are behind this drive.
And it kind of plays out, in terms of the strategies that you use as a filmmaker, where in the Brazil film, this sense of a kind of commodified version of international football merely as I say, this kind of grotesque thing being sold to an international market as part of a kind of wider gentrification, neoliberalisation of Brazil. And it's interesting that the strategies you use in terms of there's a kind of a stasis to there's a stasis in some of the Egyptian stuff, but the film has a tempo that the Brazilian one just doesn't have, and there are these kind of moments in which one witnesses these grotesque performances, and then these kind of hyper-real spaces in which they're being enacted. But for me, the key moment in the film is the point where you've got the two women, one of whom dances, and then she kind of gives her friend a wink, and then she dances as well. Is for me the absolute key point where you kind of got the film distilled in a single scene, in those terms. I'll ask two. I've got a couple more questions, and then we can open it to the floor. One is about kind of following on from this idea of bodily display. Is about gender. Which is not normally the route that I go down in these kind of things, but I think it's kind of unavoidable when you look at those two films. And this is a kind of a big and complex question when you start to think about it, in terms of the place of women in the two films. And the decisions you make in terms of how the role that they're going to play kind of as symbols or allegories or what have you, but also the extent to which those decisions are being determined by the cultures in which you're operating, and kind of really complicated questions in that case around kind of the place of women in Muslim cultures and then in Brazilian culture. So I wonder if you had any thoughts on kind of gender within the representation.
Obviously gender's very, very different in both films. Despite the aspirations of the Cairo Ultras, or that, I guess, attempt to confront public space, to take public space, to have some kind of opening up of uses of space. The reality is that men and women can't easily socialise in a situation like that, and that the kind of social cohesion amongst the ultras is actually on the base that they're all men.
Right.
I think there are some ultra women. I did see some of them at some of the protests, but they're not really participating fully within it, and they're segregated off. So that kind of that gender issue is a massive one. It is, but it's coming out of that cultural context, and there was no way to for them to deal with that. It's part of something that's far more rigid. Brazil's totally different. football. Well, okay, there's different kinds of football. There's two, certainly at least two, if not more. There's the domestic football and domestic fans, and then there's the national team, and this mobilises a completely different demographic and much broader section of society. And really everybody, my impression of the World Cup was almost like everybody goes out to watch the games. They create street parties, everywhere and anywhere. And you have a number of kind of entertainment things that are obviously drawn on that carnival tradition. So that's where the dancing girls come in to that scenario. But the kind of real football fans, the Torcidas, would. I mean, some of them don't support the national team.
And that's the German flag.
Well, I asked those guys. I said, "Why you?" That was the day of the game when people remember when Germany decimated Brazil. That was like a couple of hours before they were, getting prepared for the game. And I just sort of said, I mean, the first question was why? Why are you doing this? And the guys just said, "I'll just annoy people." And they had, you might have noticed in the background, a couple of guys had because it's very interesting. The most popular team in Rio, their strip is actually the German second strip, the red and black stripes. So they even brought out a sort of commemorative jersey after Germany won. And I met some other fans that said we're Torcidas said that we're supporting Germany.
Wow.
Even as the World Cup had just begun. So there's a kind of, from the sort of genuine hardcore fan base, there's a sort of cynicism towards the national operation, because what it is it's very much a sort of mediated thing. And actually what the ambition of the World Cup of FIFA, their model, is what they're trying to do is they're trying to create a spectacle within the stadium for the television broadcast. So any fans that are in the stadium in that context are rendered that. There's nothing actually, there's nothing else happening. So all these kind of cutaways, and you kind of, if you analyse the games, you won't see very many, mulatto or dark-skinned Brazilians at those games. So there's a very different kind of culture operating there, one that isn't as dedicated to football, perhaps. But certainly in the spectacle of the street football viewings, the demographic is gender-wise like 50-50. It's much more like a party than watching football. It's actually, football just provides the backdrop to the party, really, People are not really invested in watching football closely, appreciating it very much. So it's a very different kind of thing. Obviously football in Egypt is, gender-wise, is almost a completely male operation. And sorry, I also, just as an addition, is also met Torcidas who were women, who were very active within their groups. Some of them were like leaders of their sections and stuff like that. So there seems to be no gender division or discrimination or disadvantage placed towards women to be actually fully participatory parts of that football culture.
Okay.
Which would be a big difference.
I mean, I guess what I was driving at is the extent to which those dancing girls serve as a kind of very useful metaphor for some kind of really grotesque, commodified version of, and that's the potency of that symbol lies in that kind of commodified sexuality. It's interesting the extent to which your vocabulary as a filmmaker, the kind of metaphors and symbols available to you are determined by the culture in which you're operating. And then just one final question about the place of text in the work, which I don't think we've spoken about as much as we should do. There is, this may simply be because I'm not as clued up on the kind of histories of filmmaking and video art as I am about photography, but it seems to me that the use of text in your films kind of anchors your film work in a tradition that kind of stretches really from a kind of 70s critique of the photograph, documentary photographing people like Martha Rosler, through to, there's kind of people doing it at the moment with internet search terms. There's this kind of new wave of something similar and related in terms of the kind of the unreliability of both image and text, and and that as a kind of very productive tension. So I sort of wonder, could you say a little bit more about that in the work, and how really the kind of how you go about making those decisions? Because presumably that's kind of quite a complex process in terms of how you put these things together.
Yeah, it's really it's certainly a bigger challenge than actually working with the imagery.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, what I actually have started to, because obviously I have to get the material. I mean, not always you've got to get it transcribed, and that's a lengthy process. But then I've got to get it translated at the same time or afterwards. So I've always ended up working with something that looks like a film script. You know, I've always just through that process, and like with the Brazilian film, there was 14 interviews, 20,000 words, and it's down to 170, So it's because it's obvious that like reading and looking are very different things, and that the text coming over the image is quite. It's got an imposition. It's actually quite crass in a way. It's. I mean, it's. You could say, you could talk about 70s. Obviously, political Marxist cinema comes into the framework here. But actually, also, so does like tabloids, advertising, in a contemporary sense. So actually, in a way, the kind of way it looks is quite conventional. Actually, it's sort of anti-art or anti-film in some ways, I think. So there's a kind of interesting tension to play with, apart from reading and looking, but also that kind of convention of low art, high art, or something slightly crass. But it actually kind of just grew out of a very organic process of where, because I'm working with languages, I obviously have to have. You feel like I've got to have subtitles. I've got to, if you're going to have somebody speak to camera, you want to give them a voice. You don't want to leave that suspended. So in a way, it kind of grew out of that, and it literally started to grow. And I just started to like the wrongness of it. Actually, perhaps wrong thinking, but that's just me. Anyway, I might be wrong in that perception.
Wonderful. Okay, so we can open it up if anyone has any questions.
Those are two really good films. I really enjoyed them. Luckily enough, I went to Brazil for the World Cup, and during the day when they lost to Germany 7-1, I've never seen a city lose its buzz so quickly. It started to rain, and they shot all the clubs down. Me and my friends had to go home, back to the favela, because of course we looked German. To stay in. I was just wondering what you thought about if Brazil were to win the World Cup, how would the social resistance be numbed? So I thought after the day after they lost, I saw many more riots through Rio. I think that was a pinnacle point when they lost against Germany.
Well, I don't know. I'd actually really disagree with you, if that's okay, if we can disagree. I watched it in the place I was staying in, this favela, which is in the North Zone, Complexo de Alemão is what it's called, and it has very few gentrification possibilities, because it's like an hour and a half from Copacabana, and the central zone, south zone, all the nice bits of Rio are. So there's kind of no foreigners there, and there's nothing happening there. And I watched the game in the local kind of square with, in a bar, and really, what they did actually after the first half, they, at the intermission they put on music, and they actually never put the commentary on after the first half. So you just had like this music playing and this couple of screens, and everybody just ignored it actually. And I didn't notice any massive downturn. I think obviously people were kind of disappointed. But in terms of the very, very small marginalized protest movements that exist, I mean, really, they were caught up in something that really wasn't related to the World Cup at all. So, for instance, the filming you see at the end, where I interviewed, Pedro, stop saying interviewed, where Pedro said that statement, and where you see the kind of riot and the horses and all that. that was kind of a large-ish gathering. That was about 500 people,
Okay.
which was much larger than any of the others I went to. And that was because the government, 2 days before, had arrested 12 people that were part of that kind of protest movement on the most spurious of charges at home. Like one girl was arrested because her father had an old gun that didn't have a permit, you know, but like, you know, it was like gun on TV, you know, this is the protest movement, you know, this is the threat. So that kind of did get a response and kind of got more people involved. But you know, the kind of people that were involved in that protest movement are very middle class, you know, or lower middle class, teachers, stuff like that. It's really the kind of constituent. And for instance, the favela people have just kind of distanced themselves from that protest movement. They're not interested in it, they're not invested in it, they won't go to protest. So although those people are protesting on their behalf and are pointing out banners that say, this happened in Brazil, you know, this somebody was killed, etc., etc. You know, the favelados are not actually invested in that, and they look on that as a sort of middle class operation, and they feel more, and quite rightly, they feel a lot more oppressed. So in a way, that kind of coalition of people that are protesting against kind of social reforms that the government are pushing through are kind of operating on their own. Without the support of the media. I mean, there's no Brazilian media didn't touch any of those protests, didn't film any of them, didn't get any TV coverage, just didn't happen. And you know, the same government was re-elected in last month. So you know, it's kind of stumbling on or whatever towards the Olympics in 2016. So the problems are pretty. You know, I don't think football or the fate of the national team was really going to affect long-term the fate of that kind of opposition movement or the kind of political issues in Brazil.
I was wondering, after the extremes of the ultras, were you, well, maybe disappointed is the wrong sort of word, but were you slightly disappointed that the people expected much worse resistance during the World Cup?
No. Yeah, I'm just thinking I could have tried to stir things up. No, it was, you know, it's a completely different kind of situation. You know, the two very different places, very different trajectories politically and socially. Brazil was for me was very tense and was pretty terrifying actually. And a lot of the footage you see at the end there in that riot scene, I wasn't filming as such. You know?
Right. Yeah.
I wasn't looking through the camera. You know, at that point I was just trying to get out of there, and I couldn't get out of there. I was kind of kettled in that space. I was terrified because the police were incredibly brutal. Vicious, and you know, having a camera was going to make you more of a target than not. So it was pretty. It may not come across, but it was intense enough. And then in Brazil, I don't know how you felt your time there, but you know, there's a kind of paranoia in Brazil because there are these social tensions there. So I felt quite on edge. People I talked to had lots of terrible stories about street violence, robberies, stuff like that. So there's a kind of currency or current of paranoia or edginess that's there. But the thing is, it's set against this, you know, absolutely beautiful city, one of the most beautiful places you could visit. This amazing, languid, hedonistic kind of place, you know, like where you can really, you know, enjoy yourself. But yet there's a sense that there are real social problems there. They're very, you know, endemic, and you know, I mean, that's why I wanted to stay in a favela, was to kind of, in a sense, not stay in a posher part of the city where you wouldn't really maybe sense that very visibly. You know, you'd still be kind of operating in a very, well, actually the fan zone in Copacabana was totally controlled by cops, so I mean, nothing was ever going to happen to you there. So yeah, I mean the favela was very tense, and every time I filmed, I had to have somebody with me to kind of negotiate the space. It was, although it looks great, and you know, you're kind of thinking, wow, this is my cliche picture of Brazil. You know, everybody's out in the street, and it's great. But actually, the particular favela I was in has, you know, has issues because of this. I don't know, because of the government, I guess, because of their what they call pacification, which is where they send in special police units. Which in that favela, they killed about 40 people in a week or 10 days, and it was like being filmed live on television. People were watching it, stuff from helicopters. So it's and there's, you know, the street sell drugs everywhere. So walking around, you can very easily, you know, do the wrong thing, you know, end up in the wrong place. And you know, I was very cautious because I didn't want to do anything stupid, you know, but also, you know, you're kind of aware that, yeah, you know, it's difficult to operate in those places. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I've got a similar project that I'm doing as a part of my PhD, and I'm from Brazil, so I was there filming, doing the protests in 2013,
Yeah, all right.
and then doing the World Cup, so the spirit pre-World Cup sort of thing, and everyone was really, really nervous about this World Cup. Really very nervous because we thought that mass protests were going to start again, and they were going to be as bad as they were, because they started off being actually quite pacific. I went to quite a few of them, filmed in loads of them as a woman, went there with my camera, it was okay, but they actually took a turn for the worse quite quickly, which was when the media and the police and people were actually tweeting and putting on Facebook that the media was not covering this and people wanted to see this instead of seeing the soap operas. And that's when the media were like, okay, well, we have to cover this now. And then they went there, and then obviously then the government got involved and the police got involved, and there was all this sort of censorship thing happening. And then that kind of took us back to 1984, where we also had massive mass movement protests, and that was sort of the biggest one that Brazil ever seen, and that reoccurred again in 2013. So I guess my question for you is, are you planning on going back and kind of see if it's going to happen again for the Olympics? And because there's still this kind of vibe out there in Brazil that it's not the end. I mean, although Dilma got re-elected again, not many people are happy. She got re-elected with 51%. So that means that 50% of the country is completely pissed off that she got elected again. And how are things?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not sure if I'm going to go back for the Olympics, but I mean, I have to say that I didn't want to, I hope I didn't come across as being a bit blasé about the protesters. You know, I was extremely impressed by them, by the people I met, by what they told me about 2013, and by their determination to continue. I mean, it's really remarkable, because I mean, my impression was they were essentially lower middle class people, you know, who have got things to lose. You know, they've got jobs to lose. They've got these things can like Pedro, his brother. I actually got out of that space with his brother because his brother had a flat around the corner. So she brought his driving license with him and some letters. So after a couple of hours, we were able to get out, persuade the cops that. You know, and I was like with him. When I went to his flat, then I met his wife, and I mean, I think she's doing an MA in sociology or something, but she didn't go to the protest that day because she had an exam in about 2 days, and she didn't want to get beaten up, she didn't want to get tear gassed, she didn't want to get arrested, you know. So, like, I'm sort of thinking, all these, you know, friends that I know that are doing MAs or doing PhDs or teaching in universities, not many of them would even really touch a situation like that, because that, like I said, my filming was completely random because I was so scared. I mean, literally, it was terrifying. I mean, the police brutality was so vicious and so disproportionate, because the protesters that were there were extremely polite. Nobody threw anything. There was no violent act. And it was just by them marching around, it just eventually annoyed the cops. And, you know, there were, I don't know, maybe 5,000 cops and like 500 protesters. So I've never seen anywhere where you get that imbalance. And that force, you know, because they're armed, they're there with machine guns, they're there in full riot gear.
And this also, sorry, this
on
also goes back
horses.
to your dictatorship period. I mean, it's still military police, it's still military, it's part of the military, so they don't, I mean, when I was filming, one of the guys actually turned around to me and went like, and that's all on camera, he was like, honey, we don't speak to people, we're the military police. If you want to speak to someone, you talk to a counsellor or a psychologist. We're here to act upon this. Like, if that's how intense completely.
But still, in a sense, like it's remarkable that people are brave enough, literally, to resist that. You know, to take that on, to take on that kind of. Because what people told me is that the military, because of that fascist legacy, you know, are actually kind of out of control. You know, they've got their own power structure, they've got their own finances. You know, so even if the government wanted to try and make them accountable, they would actually struggle to do that. That they're actually so powerful, you know. And it certainly looked like it. And the kind of swagger and the kind of confidence. I mean, because initially, I mean, I'm kind of getting anecdotal here and stuff. But initially, when I wanted to get out of there, I actually was stupid enough to think, as a kind of greenhorn tourist, I could just sort of bluff my way out and say, I just got caught here, you know. And first I tried to kind of just walk through, you know, like, don't be dumb, you know, like, just ignore it. And they just grabbed me and, like, really physically threw me back. And then I thought, okay, I'll go around another street and I'll just go up and go, oh, please, you know. And it was like, no chance. I mean, it was just absolutely no way. They just didn't care. They were really enjoying that exercise of power, you know. So yeah.
Okay, last question.
You presented the films saying that you weren't in Cairo when the political upheaval happened. But my question is there a comment made or a comment to be made about the film in Cairo, about the fail of democracy in Egypt? Seeing in the film, they seem to organize very well themselves for protests. They seem to demand justice. They seem to be able to put pressure onto government and to, you know, the judiciary, etc. But democracy fails miserably there. You know, why? What happens? Is there a comment there made?
Well, you've got to kind of consider the forces that are aligned against any progressive politics in somewhere like Egypt. You know, you've got internal pressures, you've got internal power, what they call the deep state. I mean, you know, they may have got rid of the figurehead of Mubarak, but, you know, nothing changed in the country. Same people still own everything. Same, you know, there's no realignment, no just redistribution of wealth or any of these, or no accountability over police brutality, none of that. You know, basically the police just retreated for a year and let people look after themselves on the streets. That's what happened. And now they're back in a big way, you know, they're back re-elected. So there's a very, very powerful internal setup there that's very hard to dismantle. Living in Egypt from 2012, 2013 and 2014, but you know, it was like incredibly exhausting place to be. You know, there was almost a sense of like rioting happening 24 hours, 7 days a week for a year. You know, I mean, I was like going to work in the morning at 8 in the morning, and there's a full-scale riot going on, petrol bombs, bullets, everything, and you're sort of just walking your way through this. The economy completely decimated. A lot of, you know, working class, lower class people depend on tourism to get a few extra black market money. That's completely decimated somewhere like Cairo. There's no tourists. I mean, the odd busload comes in, but you know, they never move around the city. So, you know, people were very exhausted. They were they were looking for a simple answer. So entering into some kind of discourse around revolutionary politics, most people can't do that. They've got too many simple issues like surviving on a day-to-day basis. So the ultras were pretty easy for the government or the powers that be to dismantle. I'd say. But then also what you also need to think about when you think of somewhere like Egypt, or the fate of the movements that exploded there in 2011, is you've got to think of the regional forces. You've got to think of what, you know, the Saudi Arabians, the Qataris, all the flooding of money that they, you know, like, so for instance, the example in Egypt is when Morsi got into power, the Qataris gave the Egyptian government something like $7.5 billion. When Sisi did his coup d'etat, they got $12.5 billion from the Saudis. Okay, because the Saudis and the Qataris are rivals in that region. So that's official governmental aid. Underneath channels, who knows what's going on. Also, Egypt is completely the hinge country in keeping peace in the Middle East. You know, it borders Israel. So there's huge international stuff going on as well. So actually, in a way, you know, I mean, in terms of really creating a kind of lasting political foundation, although the 2011, you know, revolution or uprising, it actually wasn't really a revolution, you know, that's actually the point. It didn't actually reconfigure the society. And if you want to look at, you know, something that, you know, a parallel is to look at Tunisia, where, because there's no geopolitical interests, or very little, you know, Tunisia had an elected government very similar to the Muslim Brotherhood, very similar kind of conservative Islamic, but sort of middle of the road as well, government. There were a couple of protests about a year later, in 2013, and they resigned. They said, we don't want to cause any civil strife in our country, we're trying to unify the country, and now they've just had this month another set of elections and they've elected somebody else. So, you know, democracy is actually working there, and the aftermath of that. But you know, so I would say, in my sense, I can fully understand, you know, the fate of Egypt, or somewhere like Egypt, and the state oppression now is just unbelievable. I mean, all left-wing, secular, the people who actually initiated the revolution in 2011, a lot of them are in prison. There are 20,000 people in prison, and a lot of them are on hunger strike. So there's a whole series of hunger strikes. There's student protests on a weekly basis. People are getting killed in Cairo University. So there is a huge, not huge, but there is a pretty formidable opposition there, but based political movement. And that isn't even mentioning the extreme Islamic outfits that are there, that rival ISIS, and you know, 3 weeks ago killed 30 policemen in Sinai, you know, in a bombing attack. So, you know, there's basically a low-level war happening in Egypt. So that failure of democracy is, I mean, you're right, it's very regrettable, but it's also quite understandable, really, when you look at what, you know, what's going on around it.
Then are they consenting all these sort of political football asides, so they can close the time doing that rather than...
There's a protest law in Egypt now. All protests are illegal. And if you protest, I mean, last January at the 3rd anniversary of the revolution, about 30 people were killed by the police for protesting. For actually sort of, you know, commemorizing the revolution. So there's you know, there's no room, there's no political debate. The media is completely on the government side. So there's very few dissenting voices. It's actually pretty dangerous to get involved in that.
I'm going to wrap it up there.
Yeah, sorry.
Thanks, Ronnie, so much.
If anybody wants a book, there's one here. They're free. Okay, it's on the Ultras. Little response written document by Ben. You're welcome to them.